So if you want to be a leader that creates kingdom momentum, you got to know what you're doing, you got to know why, and you got to model it. The next thing you got to do is build your core and the culture. But before we do that, let's do this. How about you guys on the front row, right here? Would you guys do a little slow clap with me? Like this? There we go. How about this whole section? Center section here. We got it. Everybody. Hey, there we go. We did it. Good job. I just want to show you, if you're ever up communicating, that's how you get people to applaud. So, I want to give you really quick, that's a visual aid of creating momentum. You cannot do it alone. Because if I stood up here clapping by myself, it's just awkward, someone slow clapping alone. But if I can get a few people, if I can get a core to buy in with me, start doing it with me, it generates momentum that grows and it builds. But that only starts it. If I want to have environments, I want to have gatherings where celebration and applause is a normative thing, that's normal behavior, then I've got to create a culture of celebration and a culture of passion. Because a core will start it, but a culture sustains it. So wherever you lead, you can lead in ministry, a circle, a team, or if you lead somewhere out there in life, you lead in your home. If you want to create kingdom momentum, you've got to build a core to start it and a culture to sustain it. Let's start with the core. Build your core. This is all about who you are doing it with. Nobody creates momentum alone. There's no such thing as a lone ranger when it comes to creating momentum. And even the Lone Ranger had Tonto. So he had his own little core to generate like justice momentum. The Bible tells us, hey, like when two of you agree on something in my name, it will be done. If 2 or 3 of you come together in my name, I will be there with you. When we build a core, more of God and his kingdom come. It says 1 can send 1,000, but 2 can send 10,000 with the help of the Lord. There's this multiplying, compounding, exponential effect. When a core comes together and unifies around a common vision, there is an exponential return. So you got to build a core, but how do you do that? The best example is Jesus. He's got the best track record for creating kingdom momentum. So let me give you 3 quick things of how Jesus created momentum and how he built his core. The first thing is he invited. You just got to invite. But he took 12 of what seems like totally unlikely guys and he built a core, but it wasn't random. As random as those guys seem, it wasn't random at all. Here's the key with invitation. I see in you. If you have no idea what that is, good, because you're about to. Jesus didn't see any of those guys as who they were. He saw in them who they could be. The Holy Spirit highlighted them and he saw the potential. He saw in them the abilities and the giftings and the future. He saw in them who he wanted to be part of his core. But then he didn't wait around and wait for somebody to volunteer. He didn't wait for a big mass invitation. Like he went straight to them. As soon as they were highlighted, when he saw it, he went and he made that invitation. He made it in a compelling way. Peter, James, hey, you want to come follow me? You want to do this with me? You want to be a part of this kingdom movement? And then he said things that he knew would really resonate. Like when you're telling a fisherman, hey, if you'll follow me, I'll make you a fisher of men. That's going to grab their attention. It's the same thing with us. When we make an invitation, like you're inviting to a kids team or a student team, it's like, hey, you want to be a part of my team? I see amazing things in you. I see great things that God's gifted you with. And you know what we get to do? We get to raise up a generation defined by the hope of Jesus. We get to put them on our shoulders and launch them into everything that God has for them. Isn't that awesome? You want to come be a part of that? Like, well, I didn't before, but I guess I do now. That sounds pretty great. So it all starts with an invitation. But after you've invited, the next thing Jesus did was he included. He included, and that takes time. Here's the thing, Amos 3 says, do 2 walk together unless they have agreed to do so? He invited them, but then he got an agreement. Like they agreed, hey, and now we're gonna do this together. They agreed to have conversations. They agreed to travel together. They agreed to do things together, and it takes time. I love when Jesus invited Matthew to follow him. The very next thing that he did was he went to a dinner party that night at Matthew's house. And he didn't go to do any miracles. He didn't go to do any teaching. He went to just be included into his life, to build his core, because your core is not going to be built after one conversation. You're not going to go to the gym and build your core with one set of crunches. Like you're going to have to spend some time. It's the same. You got to invest time in people. So here's the question. Are you including people into your life? The better question, Are you including the right people in your life? Because you've only got so much time, so are you including the right people to build your core, spend the time with them? But after inviting and including, the next thing that Jesus did is he was intentional. He was so intentional with everything he did with his core. And he really knew their steps. Like he asked all of them to feed the 5,000, but he only asked Peter to walk on water. He only asked Peter, James, and John to come and watch him pray in the garden. He strengthened his core so uniquely and individually because he knew so uniquely and individually and intentionally what was each step they needed to take to strengthen them. So you gotta invite, you gotta include, and you've got to be intentional. But let me ask you this question. Do you have a core? Like, do you have a core that you can actually name them by name? Like maybe you're in a season where you have lost your core. Maybe you're in a season you don't feel like you have any momentum because you've never built that core of 2 or 3 people that are just in it with you, in your circle, on your team, some people at school, maybe with your spouse at home. But if you're gonna create momentum, you've gotta build your core. But the core starts, it's culture that sustains. So let's talk about culture, how to build culture. Culture is interesting because it's one of those things that's a lot easier to feel than it is to describe, but you know it when you see it, when you experience it. Like if you've ever gone to Chick-fil-A or McDonald's, you've experienced culture. They're both fast food restaurants, but they're both very different cultures. And every business, every church, every circle, every team, every family has a culture. Just might not be a healthy one that's going where you really want to go. I mean, culture's created by the leader. It's the beliefs, the values, and the behaviors of the leader that creates the culture because you reproduce who you are. So the difference between a team that wins and a winning team is one has a culture that fosters winning. Or an organization that innovates versus one that's innovative is a culture that fosters creativity and innovation. And the difference between a circle and a team that has a good week and a circle and a team that is experiencing miracles and seeing new people added and they're launching out leaders and people are taking next steps is one has a culture fostering those things. That's Jesus focused, it's spirit filled and life giving and is missional and a culture of authenticity and a culture of taking next steps. That's culture. So once you think about like, what's the culture where you lead? If somebody steps into your culture, what do they experience? What does it feel like? And do you like your culture? So here's the thing, if you already have culture, you can have a lot more. If you've got a great culture, and if you don't, you can change it, you can correct it. And the great example again is Jesus. He was the best at creating culture. So here's 3 quick things Jesus did on building culture. The first thing was he defined the culture. You gotta define it. He built his core pretty quickly, but then he spent 3 years defining culture. One of the things he said almost more than anything else was the kingdom is like this, kingdom is like that, kingdom is like. He was continually telling the disciples, this is the culture of the kingdom. And so if you want to have a Jesus-focused, spirit-filled, life-giving circle or team or wherever, you got to define that. You got to articulate it. If you want one that's authentic and missional and that celebrates next steps, like you got to really articulate that. And here's how you know if you're doing it, if they start repeating it back to you. If they can start articulating and they're saying the same things about what they're seeing and experiencing, you know you're dripping it in enough, so don't stop. If you're not hearing it, that means it's probably leaking faster than you're dripping it, so you need to keep dripping it in a little more and a little more. But you gotta define the culture, but after you've defined it, you gotta be the culture. We talked about this in the session before about modeling it. People can't become what they haven't seen, and Jesus was the perfect representer of kingdom culture. He didn't just tell them, then he showed them kingdom culture. We have a responsibility to actually be the culture. If you want to have culture in them, you've got to be culture for them. But then after being the culture, you got to create the culture, which primarily takes accountability and celebration. Jesus literally, he let the culture start happening by letting people operate in it. Let the culture happen, but then he held it into place. He was resolute about accountability. He was willing to have hard conversations. He was willing to coach. He was willing to empower and see people make mistakes, but use that to help them grow and to learn. He held the line on culture. I mean, he would tell Peter, hey, get behind me, Satan. You don't have the things of God in mind. He'd coach the disciples like, hey, go ahead and let those little kids come to me. It's okay. Or like, let's not call down fire on that village. I mean, he would hold the line on kingdom culture, but then you gotta celebrate too. Celebration's one of the fastest ways to create culture. You will replicate what you celebrate because people love to be celebrated. And when you have a clearly defined culture, you know it when you see it, so you can call it out and you can celebrate that person for doing that thing. And that's anywhere in life. That's in your circle, on your team, at home with your family, out in the marketplace, wherever you lead. If you want to create more culture, when you see it happen, call it out, celebrate that person. You'll start to see it happening over and over and over as you continue to celebrate it. Because here's the thing, as kingdom leaders, we have a responsibility to create a kingdom culture that honors and glorifies God wherever we lead. So here's the question around all of this. Have you built your core? And have you built a kingdom culture where you lead? Because that is required to create kingdom momentum. But every leader in this room, you can create kingdom momentum and kingdom momentum that lasts if you will build your core and you will build the culture.